salute to the flag. Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Chair Diaz, I'll turn it over to you to make introductions.
All right. So thank you again for allowing us here to present to the council. And I'd like to, actually, I'm just going to ask our commissioners to introduce themselves, and if you'd like.
Kristen Betancourt.
Jim Reed.
Jeff Powers.
Constance Anderson.
Matt Davis.
And so there's, with changes with City Hall, there's also been changes with the commission, but I think this is a great group, and we have some people here that I think we're going to continue with the momentum that we have been. So
Perfect. And if I do my math correctly, there's a missing person, correct? There's an empty
we
spot.
do, and so Nick Hackler,
Mhm.
and he announced that our last meeting was going to be his last meeting.
Okay.
So we'll be looking for an appointment.
Absolutely. So I kind of prompted you. We're going to have that appointment for the first meeting in September. That's our goal.
All right.
So we'll have an appointment.
Good. Thank you.
Perfect. All right.
I guess it would be, if there are any declarations of conflicts of interest or disqualifications. I don't believe there is any. And so basically we're here tonight, even with the staff planning, having a lot of changes also with their staff and everything. Katie is really, everyone has really stepped up. They've kind of maintained the momentum, like I said before, and they've held fast to what needs to be done to keep Turlock growing and developing the way it has. And so I think I'm going to just pass it on to Katie and let her give a little staff update.
Hey, Katie, just before you begin, because it's always awkward with two chairs in one room, I'm going to open up public participation. So if there's anyone that would like to address either the commission or the council on any item, they can at this point. Okay, let's keep public participation open, and we'll turn it over to Katie.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, Council, Planning Commission, and members of the public. Tonight we're going to give you an overview of what the Planning Commission has been working on the last year since the last time we met. So it's going to be some overview of some projects that we heard in 2017, what we've heard in 2018, and then some upcoming items that are kind of on our to-do list over the next few years, really, of items. We're always looking at ordinance amendments, things that we can do to improve our ordinance, to stay up with the times, and then to respond to any requests that we've received from the community. So some of those items that we kind of have in our to-do list, we'll go over those also. So for 2017, we have had, and really some of 2018, but we did adopt some amendments to our zoning ordinance. So we had various text amendment cleanups, and then we some of the bigger changes were the changes with undergrounding of utilities. Those requirements were put into place. That is something that we've not had there's a process we put in place with a variance application. We haven't had anyone take advantage of that yet or need to, but the exemption portion of the undergrounding utilities is something that has been used and put in place in projects, and I think has helped with some of the infill development, as was the intention of the adoption of that ordinance. So that is something we've definitely been giving out a lot to project applicants and making them aware of that change, and I think it's been well received by the development community, as a step in the right direction of achieving what needs to be done for the aesthetics and the community value, but then also being realistic about the requirements that are being put in place in projects. And that was really the goal of when we delved into that ordinance amendment. We adopted a large change to the noise ordinance and some cleanups to wireless communication, the landscaping, and then really the biggest, after I think 7 or 8 years of workshopping, the sign ordinance amendment was adopted. And so, really proud of that. That was a really big task. The Planning Commission, I think, had 13 or 14 workshops on that. Yeah, council was involved. I mean, so that was a big project, and it's something that, you know, as staff, we are working through. There's parts of the old ordinance we had memorized, and so now going back to familiarize ourselves, and so it is something that we are taking feedback as we're implementing, if there's questions about or things that don't make sense. So it will be, as all of our ordinances are, if there's items that we think need to be examined, we'll bring those back. And but it's new, it's changed, so I think the business community and the sign companies are getting used to that and are liking the change. The changes were really made to make the ordinance easier to understand, to look at, and to, you know, anyone can pick it up and know, okay, if I have this type of building, what kind of signs do I get? And so that was really the direction we took it, and I think so far the feedback has been good on that. For general plan amendments, we did adopt amendments to the West Side Industrial specific plan and the Northwest Triangle specific plan within the last year. So we looked at changing some of the land use designations, modifying the use chart, you know, looking at ways to expand the development potential in those master plan areas. So those have been adopted and are currently in place. So we'll move into subdivisions. We've had one new subdivision and quite a few time extensions. So the new time extension council's familiar with, and it's on for second reading this evening, but is the Mission Ranch project that subdivided, you know, approximately 2 acres into 6 residential lots. And so that was heard by the Planning Commission. They made a recommendation on to City Council. We've had 6 subdivision time extensions. Those are items that, you know, just come before the Planning Commission. They don't have to come on to City Council. The Planning Commission is the final deciding body on those actions. And so what we've seen is that there were multiple legislative extensions that were granted to subdivision maps during the recession. So typically subdivision maps have an initial life of 3 years, and then it can apply for a 3-year extension. But with those legislative extensions, they were, you know, state put into place that they were, you know, extended at mandatory, and that the local extensions could still be granted. So we're seeing those legislative extensions have stopped, and so now we're having some of these subdivision maps coming back asking for those time extensions. And I think, you know, the Planning Commission can chime in if they have anything to add, but these are a little difficult of an item when we bring them forward, because within the Subdivision Map Act, it's very specific when you have a vested map that extensions have to be granted unless there are new health and safety issues or risks or factors to not grant those extensions. And so the scope is a little more limited in what we're looking at versus the findings of a brand new subdivision map, but the process is the same. So there's still public noticing that goes out. So you could have a subdivision map that when it was originally approved was totally vacant around it. You now have subdivisions that have developed around it, and people, neighbors get noticed, and they're saying, coming to the Planning Commission saying, well, you know, I don't want 60 more lots behind me. You know, I have concerns. And, you know, the Planning Commission definitely listens to those concerns, but really unless they rise to a level of a health and safety risk or some new information that wasn't part of what was evaluated originally as part of the subdivision map, it is really something that the extension needs to be granted unless there, you know, is a very big risk to do so. So I don't know if anyone, but, so we have had 6 of those in the last year. 2 of them, good news, are under construction currently. And so, you know, I think that's a good sign. So we've had, you know, the Legends North 3, and you can see that subdivision map was originally approved in 2005. So, you know, these are things that have been around for a while. The Monteverde subdivision, which is under construction there next to Home Depot. Macune Townhomes was approved in 2006. The Legends North 3 and Macune Townhomes are the 2 final remaining subdivisions within the Northeast Turlock Master Plan area. So once those are, you know, developed, that master plan will be really fully built out. then the three others were the Fairbanks Ranch, the Les Chateaux subdivision, which Fairbanks Ranch is moving dirt and grading out there, and then the Park Villas, which again was an older one, originally approved in 2005.
And they just recently came to us for that extension, and that was one of the ones that I think, as a community, that area wasn't developed in 2005 near Pittman and all that there. So those homes then seeing, and then also with traffic and so forth, different things have changed. So it is difficult when it, but I think we're seeing developers that are understanding and I think basing on some suggestions, but I think that's right.
Yeah.
This last one.
Had one of our, planning commissioners that's been on for quite a few years, tell me after the Park Villas, like that was one of the hardest projects we've had to consider because I understand the neighbors' concerns and some of that are just, existing deficiencies that aren't part of the project, but, we also have our role and our findings to make, and the project itself meets those. And so, something that, I think on the face of it should be pretty straightforward, being a time extension. The projects there have been, I think, in the last year, some of the more difficult items that we've been looking at with the Planning Commission and bringing forward, and I think with the public also, because there's sometimes a feeling of, well, you're sending me a notice, and I'm coming to this public hearing, but now you're telling me it's really limited the scope of how you can deny or change this project. But, that is what the government code has put in place, so.
And I guess to that point, from the other side of the arena, is the reality that while there may be zoning that's in effect, we also have the mandate that, oh, by the way, because it's zoned that way, you will develop in this way. Well, if you don't have a willing developer to develop, it's going to sit blank, which of course thwarts our effort for backfill and building out to 70% before we go anywhere else. So it's kind of it's more than just a delicate balance.
Sure.
And so we do have that understanding, but it's not an easy, so thank you for carrying the torch in that arena.
So moving on from subdivisions, conditional use permits are also within the purview of the Planning Commission. So conditional use permits are uses that are listed in the zoning ordinance that are conditionally allowed. They're not just a permitted use by right. So there's something that needs to be examined by the Planning Commission to make sure that it's a compatible use with the surrounding area, that it's in conformity with the general plan, and that it's not going to create any adverse impacts, to the surrounding area. And so an example of a couple of those that the Planning Commission has heard is the Mirage Banquet Hall. That was approved. That's a 43,000 square foot banquet hall and a 7,000 square foot restaurant proposed at the corner of Kilroy and West Main. And so that was one example of an item that went through a conditional use permit. And part of that too, the Planning Commission's looking at the design of the building in conformance with our design guidelines and making sure that we're getting buildings that are aesthetically meeting the expectations of the community. The La Quinta Hotel just went forward to Planning Commission. This project is just south of Taylor Road on Golden State, a 85-room, 4-story hotel. The reason that this went forward as a conditional use permit, the use itself is permitted, but within the Northwest Triangle specific plan, there is a height limitation of 35 feet. So to exceed that requires a conditional use permit. And so at being, a little over 60 feet in height, to the tower elements, that had to go forward through the public hearing and to the Planning Commission. There was a concern from a neighbor about the use and the height of the building, and so that's the discussion the Planning Commission had and weighed those aesthetic impacts and looking at the heights of the building. It's interesting in the regular zoning ordinance, we don't have that height limitation in the same heavy commercial zoning district, and so that's been something that the Planning Commission has asked that staff look into and potentially bring back. Is there a reason for having a more restrictive height limitation in that master plan? So that's something that's made its way to our wish list to look into and really understand and see if, is that something that should continue to be there? Should we look at aligning that with the zoning ordinance?
And I think we're seeing more and more projects that are wanting to go up. And I think, again, using land, less land and being, we're gonna see more and more projects that are gonna be, and we have some excellent ones here in Turlock, already with across the street from the university, student housing, and so we went from 3-story canal, up our senior housing. That was the first, so I think as a city, we're gonna see more and more of that.
So, other types of items that go to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission, also the government calls for any acquisition, disposition, abandonment of public property for the planning body to make a general plan conformity finding. So any of those kind of proposed actions do go forward to Planning Commission for looking at conformance with the general plan. Are there general plan policies that support or say that this particular property should not be disposed of or should not be acquired or should be? And so looking at that and really then looking to at other master plans. So for example, the most recent was the disposition of 401 3rd Street was brought forward for a general plan conformity finding. So the planning can asks questions. Well, is that something that's needed in the water master plan? We have a water tank on part of the property. Do we need the other part of the property? What are the city's plans? Well, it's been evaluated that portion is not needed within any of the utility plans. Well, then it is in conformity with the general plan, and that's what the Planning Commission found. But those are the types of questions and items that they're looking at when those items come before them. The Planning Commission also gets, the Planning Division is referred Stanislaus County planning items. And so we take those forward to the Planning Commission, typically as informational items, bring forward what the request is for the project, and then what staff's response has been. If there's something that is controversial or not something that staff feels we have direction on how to respond to, then that's something we would bring forward as an item to the Planning Commission and sometimes ultimately on to City Council if there's policy decisions that need to be made. But consistently in our responses to these referral items, we're looking for conformance to city design standards, looking at impacts of development on our borders and understanding impacts to our transportation system, our public safety. And so those are the types of conditions and comments that we get back consistently on these items that come forward as the county referral items. So, for example, the Best RV, there's a Sylvan Sons, a composting facility, and then Dan Avila and Sons looking at, at one point has come forward with a request to amend some conditions. That went forward to Planning Commission and City Council within the last year. And then he's also applied for a time extension. So really the nature of the referral item depends on the level of review. But those are items, any referral items we get, we always give up to the Planning Commission as at a minimum of an informational item. So, and then minor discretionary permits, I threw these in here for information. These are items that don't go on to the Planning Commission. These are handled at the staff level through the authority that planning staff has been delegated by the City Council. And so these are the types of projects that are permitted uses in the zoning district that they're in. They're adhering to all of the development standards. And so we're doing a design review on them. These range anywhere from sign programs to shopping centers, large industrial buildings. It really depends these can really vary, and there's some large projects that are able to go through this expedited review because of the design standards, the master plans that have been put in place that allow staff to be able to review these projects for conformity. And really, these projects can be reviewed in, 8 to 10 or 10 to 12 weeks through a staff level process versus, having to go through public hearings, which can be a lengthier process. And so just to give you kind of an update, in 2017, we processed 22 minor discretionary permits. And so far in 2010, we have processed 10. And just to give you some kinds of examples of the scope of these projects, Superstores Industry, I think more commonly known as Sunnyside Farms, on Spangler and Kilroy, has a large 155,000 square foot processing center expansion that is under construction, and that was done through a minor discretionary permit. This is also a project with large projects that, or small projects, any projects where they have a tight timeline or there's some, apprehension or confusion about what the process is going to be, what is inspection and plan check going to look like. All of the different staff members from engineering, planning, building, the fire department, anyone that's involved in the development process, we set up meetings every other week with the contractors, the applicants. And so Sunnyside is an example of one of these projects that we have been meeting with them for probably a year now, going before the entitlement process, but to meet and have check-ins regularly to help them with, okay, what is the next process? What is your timeline? What's your goal? And how do we help you achieve that? And they're very beneficial. I mean, sometimes just meeting and they'll say, well, what's the status of our plan check? And we'll say, well, we sent you a letter 2 weeks ago. We haven't gotten anything back. Okay, well, we didn't know we got a letter. And so sometimes just that face-to-face, back-and-forth interaction, one, helps create a comfort that I think they feel that staff's very accessible, so there's no hesitation to pick up the phone and call and, ask questions about comments, and then also bridges the gap of sometimes there's things that just get lost, and our design professional, we didn't know that they hadn't resubmitted that, and so it's really helped, keep this project on a very tight timeline because of some of their contractual obligations, and so I think it's been very beneficial, and that's something that we've started doing with projects.
Just a quick question on that, Katie. Where is that located again, the Sunnyside Farms?
That is on the corner of Kilroy and Spangler. And so they had an existing building there, their existing processing facility, and then the area where you see the building going now was parking. And so they've actually purchased the property across the street. So just across Spangler is now going to be all of they're building a large new parking lot for employee parking, truck parking, and then they're doing this facility expansion. So, it's very exciting. It's bringing a new product that they can produce. They were something that was only done on the East Coast and is now coming out, and it's adding additional jobs and expanding an existing business. So it's an exciting project, and it's a good example of what the West Side Industrial Specific Plan really laid the way for us to be able to do at the staff level with the expedited environmental and all of those items. Another example of a minor discretionary permits, the 36,000 square foot medical clinic that's been approved on Sun Valley Court, so that's north of Lowe's there. And then Turlock Corners Retail, so that's on Tuolumne and Countryside, and that's 2 retail buildings and 2 drive-through buildings, and that's the site plan that's been approved. And so, I put these up there to show that really there are large projects that are also going through staff level, and so, there's a mix of what is heard at the Planning Commission and what is done at staff level, and we're busy on all fronts, so it's good. are there any questions or comments on our project update of where we've been in the last year? So I'm gonna then move on into kind of touching on some of the areas we're looking at going. Okay. So, in the planning department, we have a Word document saved we call our wish list, and staff is always kind of adding to that as we work through different items with the ordinance. And then also we get requests from the public. So some of the items that we have, and I will say that within the last year, our focus in the planning department's really been on project delivery. And, as Elvis mentioned, with our kind of change in staffing, our priority's been keeping up on our permit turnaround times and building permit reviews. So we haven't been working as heavily on the zoning ordinance updates as we typically do, but we plan to, once everything gets back up and running, these are items we'll pick back up in the next year or two. And I think, as we've seen with the sign ordinance, they're not always a fast process, and that's intentional, and that, these are topics that we want to take out to public hearings. We want to get input, and so we do a lot of workshopping through the Planning Commission to really get a gauge from the community of, hey, we're looking at this, and what do you think? What is right for Turlock? What's right for our community, for these different areas? So RV parking is something we had that was actually initiated by a citizen, that they've asked us to look at our ordinance for that and look at those standards. And so that's something we've started looking at, and we'll continue to do so. And always with these items, part of our process is researching what do other cities do, and bring that forward for the Planning Commission to consider, and then hearing from the public. So the other is looking at our second dwelling unit ordinance. Some of that is really response to change in state law. The state's really pushing a direction to try to make it much easier, permitting-wise and regulation-wise, for second dwelling units to be constructed and permitted. And so there's continual change in state law as it relates to second dwelling units. And so some of that is looking at our ordinance and making sure we're in compliance with state law. And then looking to and knowing, the desire for additional housing in California is, are there standards that we want to look at, and, what makes sense? So that's something that's on our radar. Graduated density is areas that we have some smaller, what we call railroad lots, kind of long, skinny lots that are zoned medium density residential. And what we're seeing is that when we get into all of the requirements that we have in the zoning district, with the need for the fire turnarounds and trash enclosures, when we get to actually applying all of those standards onto these properties, it's not possible to hit the densities that they're zoned for. And so it's looking at kind of an overlay to help take those things into consideration to be able to get development on these lots, but then also other ways that we could potentially incentivize, maybe increase in density, or some things that if we could try to incentivize the consolidation of lots. So to try to say, okay, well, I have this lot, but now if I can buy the lot next door that's also vacant, now I can get some, additional density or units to try to incentivize, and get that kind of infill development that our general plan has looked for. The neo-traditional overlay is looking at areas of town that were built some time ago under different standards. So, at one point you could have a 4-foot setback if your neighbor had a 6-foot side yard setback. And now well, that's hard to administer. They did away with that quite some time ago and gone to a 5 and 5. But now we have people coming in that were built at the 4-foot setback and say, well, I want to add on to my house. Well, our current standard would say you have to set that in a foot. And so looking at acknowledging an area of town where standards were different and coming up with a more expedited process that we can allow them to do some additions and modifications without having to go through, a variance or a plan development type process. With the adoption of the new sign ordinance, There is a provision in there that we will adopt a wayfinding sign program. So that is something that we need to, work on and develop some standards for in response to the new sign ordinance criteria that we've developed. And so that will be looking at, what types of facilities meet the threshold for providing wayfinding signs, what should the design of those signs be, what should the process be for asking that, how are they, financed, where are they placed, how far away from these destinations are they placed, and so that's something we'll be looking to what other cities have done for these sign programs and then bringing it back to understand what's a good design for us. Some of this was done with the beautification master plan that was adopted. It took a preliminary look at some designs, but it's really not the wayfinding sign program that the ordinance talks about that we will establish. So that's something that we will be looking into. And I mentioned there was some desire to look into the height limit in the Northwest Triangle specific plan. We've been getting multiple requests from a cell phone provider to look at our small cell wireless facilities ordinance, or specifically that they would like an allowance for these facilities to be able to be located within the public right-of-way. Currently, our wireless ordinance does allow for small cells could be placed on private property, depending on height, can be done through an expedited permitting process of a minor administrative approval or an MDP if they get into certain heights, and that would require a conditional use permit. So there is already an allowance for these on private property, but the request that we're getting is for these to be in the public right-of-way, and currently our ordinance doesn't allow for that. I don't know if this would be something that would be housed in the zoning ordinance per se, or in another section of the municipal code, but it's something that planning would work with our city engineer and engineering department on, and municipal services, and would ultimately be brought forward to the question of if that's something we wanted to entertain, and if we did, then what kinds of standards would we want to have in place to look at, from the planning commission's perspective. There's always the concerns about aesthetic impacts, and then also the practical impacts of the cost, the maintenance, the electricity, all of those items. So that's a request that we've been getting very consistently for a year or so now, and something we said that we would ask the question and kind of see where it went. And then kind of lastly, we're working in conjunction with really all the other city departments on the update to the Parks Master Plan, which will then play into the update of the Parks fee program. So that's all the items that I had for you and what we've been busily working on.
All right. Any questions or comments? Yes, Councilmember Black.
So I know with those cell towers, a lot of places, even DC cities, have worked with the schools and like their flag poles, things of that nature. They're utilizing them all over, and seems almost always successful. There's always a few people who are concerned about Big Brother being able to access them, but it seems like it's the ability to go underground is getting lost, and more is going on top, and so that's one of the ways they're utilizing it, just as food for thought.
Any additional questions or comments? Thanks, Katie. Yes, Councilmember Diart.
Well, on the presentation, no. But I think as a general comment, I'd just like to say thank you, because we're enjoying a legacy of planning activity which has just made Turlock what it is. And I think it's due in large part to predecessors of all of ours, whether it's planning commissions prior, staff prior, city councils prior. We are enjoying the fruit of their labors. Let's continue to work together, because I think that there's a lot that can be done, still needs to be done. Obviously, you've got a laundry list of things that needs to be done. But thank you for your efforts and for the bravery in taking on the task at hand. And we join you in that effort. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, I echo your sentiments. I think that you all do a really good job, and obviously one size doesn't fit all when it comes to planning decisions, and so you guys do a good job of looking at it case by case. not bringing this up because Councilmember Jacob, or Vice Mayor Jacob brought up some concerns with this, but even taking a small plot and doing the gated cul-de-sac idea and concept is thinking outside the box. Now, there are concerns, very legitimate, that the Vice Mayor brought up about, okay, what happens with these other cul-de-sacs, and is that the type of thing we want to do throughout the community? But that's what you guys take seriously, and you guys look through that and make sure that things are working well, but you're also not so stringent and making sure you make good decisions on a case-by-case basis. So, yeah. Perfect.
This is your chance. Only once a year.
Take your shot.
And no, you can't request to get off the commission. You're stuck, all of you are stuck on there, yeah.
Speak now or forever hold your
Yeah, yeah, I know. Any other comments from the council or the audience at this time? All right, bringing it back, pretty good. If there's nothing else, do you want to adjourn your commission meeting before us? All right, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right, we have a motion by Councilmember DeHart, second by Councilmember Bublak. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We're adjourned. Are you guys adjourned?
We're adjourned.
All right, good. Thanks.